Today we're going to talk about the real distinction between act and potency and how that relates to the modern analytic distinction between categorical and dispositional properties. So an important metaphysical question is whether the distinction between act and potency and also between a substance and its powers are real distinctions. But we need to ask first, what does that mean? So that brings us to the scholastic theory of distinctions that Feser covers in the third section of chapter 1, bringing it to a close. So we'll try to go through this fairly quickly. The basic distinction is between real and logical distinctions. Real and logical distinctions. So a real distinction reflects a distinction in extra-mental reality, in mind-independent reality, in the world out there, as philosophers like to say, out there outside of my mind. That's a real distinction. A distinction in things, not just in the way of thinking about things. By contrast, the logical distinction, or a distinction of reason, as it is also known, is going to be a distinction in our ways of thinking about extra-mental reality. So that's the distinction. Here we have a distinction in extra-mental reality itself, the world outside of and independent of our mind. And here we have a distinction in our ways of thinking about extra-mental reality. But there are various subdivisions here. And so the real distinction can be distinguished between a major or absolute version and a minor or modal version of a real distinction. Major, absolute, minor, or modal. And the major or absolute is the distinction between entities. Whether these are individual parts of an object, individual objects themselves, between a substance and its positive accidents, namely its color, its accidental properties, or between the accidents themselves, between the color and the other qualities of a thing, for example. Whereas the minor or modal distinction is just a distinction between a thing and its modes, which have no existence apart from a thing. For example, between a material object and its state of rest or motion. So that's the first part. Now, the logical distinctions also have a couple different ways of branching off here. There's purely logical, and then there's merely virtual. So the purely logical are the basic, straightforward types of logical distinctions. A distinction merely in our ways of thinking about things. Something that's merely verbal or without any foundation in reality. So think of purely logical. I mean, the word logical is related to the word for word, right? So these would be just verbal distinctions. Human being versus rational animal. There's no real distinction there. It's just two different ways of speaking about the same thing. Whereas a virtual distinction is trickier because it will have some foundation in reality. So even though it's a logical distinction, this virtual distinction will have some foundation in reality. So, for example, the virtual distinction that Feser focuses on is that between rationality and animality. Rationality and animality. So, in human beings, they're the same. Because our species manifests itself as a rational animal. Our animality is part and parcel, or better to say that our rationality is part and parcel of our animality. That these things basically are the same thing in reality, but there is some grounds for distinguishing them because we're aware of the fact that not all animals possess rationality. And similarly, not all rational beings possess animality necessarily. There could be angels and God and things like that don't have animality. So we have a couple different sub-distinctions here between a major or perfect virtual logical distinction, and a minor or imperfect virtual logical distinction. Where the first here, the major or perfect, is where concepts don't include each other, like animality and rationality. The minor or imperfect is where the concepts do include each other. For example, the concept being is included in the concept substance in a way that animality and rationality are not included in each other. So that's the basic system here of the real and logical distinctions as the scholastics understood them. And there are some nuances here, but the thing that we want to really focus on here is the marks of a real distinction, because that's where a lot of the disputes are going to come in that are metaphysically important. Is this a real distinction or is it not a real distinction? So some of the criteria of real distinction that have been proposed, and not just with the scholastics, but in subsequent metaphysics as well, are separability, contrariety of concepts, and efficient causality. So if two things are separable from each other, if they exist separately, then that's taken to be a real distinction. If they involve contrary concepts, so if the two concepts of a thing are, contradictory to each other, they can't, something can't be square and circle at the same time, circular at the same time. That would be a reason to think that they're really distinct. And then it's also been suggested, although this is the most controversial one, that efficient causality, like a cause has to be really distinct from its effect, although that has seemed to some to actually beg the question about the real distinction of cause and effect. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. But those are the three criteria that are usually mentioned: separability, contrariety of concepts, and efficient causality. So if the intellect's activity is essential to making sense of the distinction, it's logical. That's the basic determinant of a logical distinction. The intellect's activity is essential to making sense of it. And then you can say that everything else is real. So if it's not essential in order to make a distinction that one employ the intellect, then it is a real distinction. So for example, it's an intellect's knowledge that rationality and animality occur separately that makes it possible to make the distinction between rationality and animality. They're not found together in our experience. They're always found together in our experience, but they're not entirely the same, because of the intellect can make the distinction between them, even though they're always found together in our experience. So this is the way in which Aquinas proposes to distinguish between the real and the logical. And that raises the question about, especially this most popular criterion of separability. Is separability, in that sense, a necessary distinction? And Feser argues for Thomas's view, saying that no, it is actually not a necessary distinction. We don't actually have to suppose that there's a necessary separability of two things in order for them to be really distinct, as long as it's necessary to employ our intellect in order to make the distinction. We can know that the distinction is logical. And if it's not necessary to employ our intellect in order to make the distinction, then we can infer that it's real. Now, there's a kind of indirect argument for this that Feser goes into. I'm not going to go into much detail on that. But basically, the ideas are that if it were necessary, that is, if separability were necessary in order to have a real distinction, there would have to be some intermediate type of distinction, which John Duns Scotus, for example, calls a formal distinction. But this is unsustainable. It collapses into either a real or a virtual distinction. Also, there are counterexamples that have been suggested by other philosophers, for example, by Odenberg, that the radius of a circle is really distinct from its circumference, although they are inseparable. So you seem to have counterexamples of things that are really distinct in the mind independent reality itself, the radius of a circle and its circumference, but they are inseparable from one another because of the nature of circularity. So those are just a couple of the arguments that Feser puts in support of Aquinas' view that real distinction does not require separability. But for our purposes, the most important thing to keep in mind is the conclusion itself. Real distinctions do not involve separability. Real distinctions do not involve separability. Okay, so if we go on then to discuss the implications of this, we begin to see that it supports the view that, in fact, the distinctions between act and potency and a substance and its powers are real distinctions. And the argument for the real distinction between act and potency, which is found on page 78, it's pretty simple and straightforward. It goes like this: that a perfection and a mere capacity for a perfection are obviously really distinct. A perfection and a mere capacity for a perfection are obviously really distinct. And then two, if a thing requires a cause really distinct from it to attain actuality, it's really distinct. So those are the basic arguments, that a perfection and a mere capacity perfection are obviously really distinct. And if a thing requires a cause really distinct from it to attain actuality, then it is really distinct. We could spell those out in more detail, but I'm not going to do that here because we've talked on a number of occasions about the basic ideas of actuality and potentiality. So hopefully with that in mind, you can see how these arguments would be spelled out in detail if we wanted to do that. The perfection is the actuality, the capacity perfection is the potentiality, and these are obviously distinct. Second, the thing requires a cause really distinct from it to attain actuality. Well, that's what a potentiality requires, a cause that's really distinct from it in order to attain actuality. So therefore, it's really distinct from its cause that is distinct from it. Okay. Arguments for the real distinction between substance and its powers on 78 and 79. First, there's an argument, and I'm just going to summarize these again here quickly, that certain powers possessed by the same substance are really distinct from each other. But if they weren't distinct from the substance that possesses them, they couldn't be distinct from each other. Certain powers possessed by the same substance are really distinct from each other, but if they weren't distinct from the substance that possesses them, they couldn't be distinct from each other. So the substance has to be distinct from its powers, right? So, pick your favorite substance, fire, water, whatever it might be. These things don't just have one power, they have various powers. But those powers are going to be distinct from each other. For example, a flame has the power to both heat and to also provide light. And those are distinct powers from each other. There are things that are able to provide light that don't have heat, and vice versa. But if they weren't distinct from each other, then they couldn't be distinct from the substance that possesses them. So they're distinct from the substance that possesses them. Second, if a power and its substance are not really distinct, then the power will be actualized whenever the substance is. But that's not obvious. That's obviously not the case, rather. So we have something like a Feser's favorite example of a phosphorus match. This is something that has the power, of course, to light a candle or whatever, but it's not always actualized. And if the substance were the same thing as its power to light a candle, then that power would have to always be actualized wherever the substance is. And we know that's not the case. And then third, to deny the real distinction between substance and its powers is to commit a category mistake, because they belong to two different categories, as we saw from our examination of Aristotle. You have on the one hand the category of substance, on the other hand the category of accident and attribute, and those are just different ways in which a being is spoken of. Okay, so we have the view then that act and potency and power and substance are really distinct. But because real distinctions do not involve separability necessarily, the fact that these are really distinct doesn't mean that they have to be separable. And that's going to turn out to be an important premise. These are really distinct. Act is really distinct from potency. Potency really distinct from act. The substance is really distinct from its powers, and its powers are really distinct from the substance. But that doesn't imply that they have to be separable, even though they're really distinct. So that's kind of a bedrock metaphysical principle that's going to be important for us as we go forward. Okay, so this leads to the first discussion question for today. Are there any sound philosophical arguments for a real distinction between act and potency? I just gave you some, but of course you could challenge any of them, so that's what I'm asking about. Are there sound philosophical arguments for a real distinction between act and potency, and a real distinction between a substance and its powers? If there are, what implications do these real distinctions have for the debate between Humeans or empiricists and power theorists over the proper metaphysical account of such things as causality and natural laws? So that's harkening back to the last discussion with the regularity theorists and the power theorists about causality and natural laws. And this is going to continue to be explored in today's video and in the future. Where we'll see that there are potential implications of this view of the real distinction between act and potency and substance and its powers for the way in which one understands causality in general. So, are there sound philosophical arguments for a real distinction between act and potency and a real distinction between a substance and its powers? And if there are, what implications do these real distinctions have for the debate between Humeans, empiricists, and power theorists over the proper metaphysical account of such things as causality and natural laws? Okay. That's going to require you to think a little bit. That's a challenging one. All right, so a word or two now about the distinction between categorical versus dispositional properties and how this fits in. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's useful to see how Feser thinks that the Scholastic metaphysics actually provides us with a useful perspective that helps to maybe dissolve some of these contemporary debates. So categorical and dispositional properties. The dispositional properties, as the name suggests, has to do with the dispositions that physical things possess, rather than sort of what they're actually manifesting at any particular time. So the idea is that dispositional properties would be expressed by true conditionals. For example, if such and such a stimulus obtains, then such and such a manifestation will occur. So classic examples are things like fragility and solubility, right? If you knock this thing onto the floor, it will break. This glass or whatever is fragile in the sense that if I drop it onto the floor, it will shatter. It has that property now, but that's a property that can only be expressed by this sort of conditional statement. If I actually drop it and it shatters, then it's no longer fragile. It's just not a fragile glass. Or at least if I grind it up into dust, it loses its fragility, right? So the fragility is a property that obtains only as a disposition. And solubility is similar kind of thing. The substance, salt or whatever it is soluble in water, but then it loses that solubility once it is exposed to the substance that it will dissolve into. And so the property of solubility exists only as a disposition. So what are the categorical properties then? The name here is less suggestive of anything in particular. It's just meant to be a contrast between dispositional. The categorical properties are non-dispositional properties, so they're to be contrasted with dispositional, but they're posited to explain why an object has the dispositional properties it does. So this is going to include things like the shape, the spatiotemporal properties, the molecular structure of the thing. And in this way, dispositions are said to be, by some philosophers at least, are said to be reducible to categorical properties. And what's the importance of this? Well, this is a way of getting around the idea of there being any real potentialities, which you've talked about before as a kind of tendency of modern philosophy as opposed to scholastic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy in general. The inclination to want to deny potentialities. And so what the categoricalist or the dispositionalist, we'll talk about the various versions of metaphysical employment of these categories or concepts. What they want to do is to basically say that there are no real potentialities. There are just dispositional properties and categorical properties, and we're trying to understand sort of how we're going to be able to understand the relationship between these two types of properties. So Feser goes and talks about the four sort of metaphysical orientations or options in analytic metaphysics for integrating these properties. They are categoricalism, property dualism, pan-dispositionalism, and monism. So the categoricalist is going to say that all dispositional properties can be reduced to categorical ones. All dispositional properties can be reduced to categorical ones, right? So you reduce, the fragility of something to its some statements about its molecular structure or something like that. That's the idea. But there are various problems that arise from this. One is that categorical properties have no intrinsic causal power. They depend for their efficacy entirely on the contingent laws of nature. And so they seem to be causally inert. And second, causal powers of things can't be explained except by reference to other things with causal powers. And so it seems like you're not really explaining how the dispositions arise from the categorical properties. That's the summary of the problems. I'm not going to go into all the nuances of this. I just want to kind of give an overview here. So the property dualist is going to say that there are irresistible dispositional properties alongside irreducible dispositional properties alongside irreducible categorical ones. So unlike the categoricalists, they're not going to try to reduce dispositional properties entirely to categorical properties. But, again, you have this sort of problem of a kind of causal inertness because you have to ask, are the categorical properties on this theory efficacious or not? And if they are, then distinct dispositional properties seems like they're not needed to account for causality, and we might just as well be dispositionalists, which is the next view. But if they're not, then the categorical properties are going to be epiphenomenal, and we might as well opt for pan-dispositionalism. So that's the problem with that one. I think I said that wrong. So let me try that again. If the causal properties are efficacious or not, then we don't need distinct dispositional properties. Sorry, if the categorical properties are efficacious, then we don't need dispositional properties. And so we might just as well be categoricalists. That's what I wanted to say, right? So basically the idea here is that property dualism is going to face pressures to either become categoricalism or dispositionalism, pan-dispositionalism. Because if you say the categorical properties are efficacious, then it seems like you're just a categoricalist. And why do you need to say that they're independent dispositional properties? But if they're not efficacious, then you might as well just be a dispositionalist and say all the work's being done by dispositional properties. But dispositionalism has problems too, because dispositionalism says all properties are dispositional. That's pan-dispositionalism. All things are dispositional, right? And therefore, there are no irreducible categorical properties. But here you have a problem that is evocative almost of French postmodernism or something, Derrida or Deleuze or something like that, where there's a constant deferral because a dispositional property, is a property that is obtains only on the condition, right? Remember, something is fragile only if on such and such a condition it would do this. But then if you say, okay, what makes that disposition obtain? It's supposed to be another disposition. Then you have to ask, well, what makes that disposition obtain? Because that's also a conditional property. And so you end up in a kind of infinite regress or a kind of circularity. But the problem is that you can't fix the identity of a property. That's the aspect of it that reminds me of postmodernism. To say sort of what fragility is, if you're a pan-dispositionalist, it seems like you're just running around in circles defining things in terms of other things that themselves need to be defined. And you never end up with a fixed identity of what this property is. So that's the problem with this one. And then you have various forms of monism, which will say that, well, neither categorical nor dispositional properties are fundamental, but there's some one underlying property that either manifests itself as categorical or dispositional in different circumstances, or it somehow has like two different poles, the categorical pole and the dispositional pole. And you can see, some of the problems with this is, again, it's going to seem to face pressures to collapse into one of the other views. So this is a very fraught kind of problem in analytic metaphysics, how to understand these categorical and dispositional properties. But the Scholastic, of course, is going to suggest that you can avoid all of these problems by just admitting that there are such things as real potencies. You don't have to suppose that, there are no potencies, there are just dispositions, and these dispositions either have to be sui generis, they're unique category, or they have to be reducible categorical properties. You can say, well, no, there are potencies in things, and then actualities. And potency and act are both really distinct and inseparable. Because remember, for the Thomas, as we just established, potency and act are both really distinct and inseparable. Except in the unique case of God, of course, who is pure actuality. So act is really distinct from potency, but yet they are inseparable in practice. It's the assumption that real distinction entails separability, according to Feser's analysis, that creates all the problems. It's what leads to the belief of the categoricalist that dispositional properties have to be reduced to the categorical. It's what leads to the belief of the pan-dispositionalist that categorical properties must be really dispositional properties. And the belief of monists that the categorical and dispositional properties must be both two sides of the same property, because they think that if you admit that they're really distinct, you have to consider them to be separable. But this is not the Thomistic view. The Thomistic view says, no, things like categorical or dispositional properties could be really distinct, yet also inseparable. And so you're avoiding all these false dichotomies that says that, well, either the categorical properties have to be foundational, or there can only be dispositional properties. The difficulties can be avoided in their entirety. And so for Feser, then, because he sees that there's no particular advantage in speaking about categorical and dispositional properties in the first place, rather than act and potency, he says metaphysics is better served by just chucking the whole distinction between categorical and dispositional properties and going back to the distinction between act and potency. So on page 87, he says, given the this is the last paragraph here, 87. He says, given the baggage associated with categorical and dispositional and contemporary philosophy, the Scholastic will, in any event, prefer to stick to the traditional jargon of act and potency. He might also be forgiven for thinking that while each side of the current debate has grasped an important part of the truth that the theory of act and potency seeks to capture, the categoricalist has captured the insight that actuality is fundamental to reality. The various brands of dispositionalism have the insight that we cannot make sense of causation without potency. Both sides have also missed the larger picture, the set of problems that spawn the development in the theory of act and potency in the first place. Making all of reality categorical or actual entails a return to Parmenidean static monism. Making all of reality dispositional or potential threatens a return to Heraclitean dynamic monism. But neither the Parmenidean nor the Heraclitean extremes are ultimately coherent, and the only way to avoid them is to affirm both act and potency as really distinct, even if inseparable aspects of reality. So you see that this earliest stage of philosophy, the pre-Socratics, are being recapitulated in the modern analytic distinction between the categoricalist and the dispositionalist. I think it's clear in the case of the dispositionalist that this kind of endless deferral of, you can't fix any property because everything's dispositional, so every dispositional property is going to be explained by another conditional, dispositional, and so on. It's like the Heraclitean flux, where everything flows into everything else. The Parmenidean, on the other hand, is this kind of static idea that there are these bedrock elements of reality, like categorical properties, that seem like because they lack potency, don't have the power to actually produce any changes in the first place. So it's interesting. Feser's analysis is that the modern dispute in metaphysics between categoricalists and dispositionalists, in their attempt to avoid Aristotelianism and the act-potency distinction, especially the Thomistic version, that sees act and potency as both really distinct and also inseparable, what they've ended up doing is just backing themselves into the corner of the old antinomy between the Parmenideans and the Heracliteans that Aristotelianism was originally designed to avoid. Okay. So, this brings us to our next topic, which is Chapter 2, and that's the discussion of efficient versus final causality. And so the idea of an efficient cause, also known as agent causation, and a final cause, also known as the end or the purpose of a thing, is already familiar from previous videos. But the thing that Feser wants to emphasize here is the way in which efficient causes actually contain within them a kind of intrinsic final causality as well. And he'll sometimes refer to this as the finality. So you get a picture like this, that the efficient cause or the agent has within it a kind of finality. There's a way in which it points in the direction of its effect. Right? So it's got this kind of intrinsic directedness towards the effect. So these are not actually separate in any kind of absolute sense, but rather they're interconnected, interrelated. And in contradistinction to the modern way of understanding efficient causality, usually in Humean terms as some kind of regularity relationship between two events, the Scholastic understanding understands causality as necessarily, in order to account for its necessity in its connection to its effect, requiring a degree of finality within it. So the only way in which a cause can possibly be necessarily connected to its effect for the scholastic is to presuppose that there is a finality within the efficient cause. So first Feser goes through a number of distinctions that pertain to final causality. The first is the intrinsic versus extrinsic. Is the function of the parts imposed upon them from outside, or does the goal come from the thing itself? These are questions we can ask about final causality. Is the function of the parts imposed on them from outside, or does the goal come from within the thing itself? So, the difference between a watch, let's say a wristwatch that tells time, where it has all these functional parts, but the parts are imposed on the thing from outside, the watchmaker. Whereas in the case of an acorn, the goal of the acorn to become an oak tree comes from within the thing itself. It's not imposed by anything outside of it. So that's the first distinction. Is the final causality extrinsic or intrinsic? Does it come from within, or is it imposed from without? Second distinction is the distinction between the end goal versus the thing's directedness towards its end goal, where the former is always extrinsic to the thing. The end goal is always extrinsic to the thing. But the directedness towards its end goal is not always extrinsic to the thing. So you might, you talk about the acorn being directed to become an oak tree. That's a goal that's extrinsic to an acorn. Obviously, you can't fit an oak tree in an acorn. And that's always going to be the case. But the directedness towards the end goal isn't always extrinsic to the thing. And again, in the case of the acorn, you have a directedness towards its goal that is intrinsic to the thing. The third distinction is whether final causality exists in a thing versus what the source is of such causality. So this is an important aspect of the Aristotelian theory that really can't be emphasized too much, because I think when we think of something having an end or goal that's directed towards some kind of perfectibility from within itself, we think that, well, that had to be put into the thing by God. And in Aristotle, for Aristotle, the natures of things alone explain their directedness towards an end. You don't need to explain the directedness of things, their teleology or finality, by appeal to a divine intellect. And that's in contrast with Plato, who thought that you did. Now, of course, Aquinas, as a Christian, is going to be sympathetic to the idea that ultimately there's a divine intellect behind this. But he's also an Aristotelian Christian. And so he took a view that's midway between that of Plato and Aristotle. He talks about the proximate versus the distal source of teleology. The proximate versus the distal. Teleology is another word for this finality here. So the proximate source of the teleology of the acorn to become an oak tree is going to be within the essence of the acorn itself, or in a sense, in the essence of being an oak tree, a member of that species. But the distal, D-I-S-T-A-L, the distant source is going to be God, ultimately, who is responsible for the essences of things. So on the Thomistic view, the issue of whether natural teleology exists can be bracketed off from the issue of its divine source. That is, he thinks that there are good philosophical arguments and reasons for thinking that things like acorns have an intrinsic teleology to them that you can establish without trying to make the case that there needs to be a watchmaker, or something analogous to a watchmaker in order to be able to account for them. We can bracket off the question of whether natural teleology exists from the issue of its divine source. And what that means that has an important consequence that atheism is insufficient grounds for dismissing natural teleology. You can believe that natural teleology is the best metaphysical philosophical account um, of the nature of things and their causal effects and so forth, without being committed to a divine origin ultimately. And then the fourth distinction he mentions is whether there's finality in nature versus whether there's irreducible teleology in the biological realm. And that's an important distinction here, because the general view of the scholastics is that there is a connection between efficient causality and final causality in general, period. It's not a feature merely of biological organisms. Every cause has to have a kind of finality within it that directs it towards its end, without which you don't have a necessary connection between the cause and the effect. You don't have an account of what the necessity of the causality is, without positing that there's some kind of finality in the thing that directs it towards its effect. So that raises the question of the distinction between living and non-living things. And for the philosopher of nature, this is the distinction between immanent versus transient causation. Immanent versus transient causation. That's how you distinguish between living and non-living things. So the first is immanent is going to be the one that pertains to living things. It begins and remains within the agent or cause. So, for example, an animal digesting its food. Whereas the transient causation is directed entirely outwards, from the cause to the external effect, like a falling boulder falling off a mountain, knocking down a tree. Now, of course, living things can also have transient causation, and typically will, but they have both. And what distinguishes them is that they have this first kind of causation that only they have, and that non-living things don't have, which only have this transient kind of causation. Okay, but then again, we come back to the critical point, which is that efficient and final causality go hand in hand. Because efficient causation is just the actualization of potency, and potency is always the potency for a specific outcome. That's worth writing down. So efficient and final causality go hand in hand. Efficient is just the actualization of potency, and potency is always directed towards a specific outcome. Put it that way. Okay, so efficient and final causality go hand in hand. Efficient is just the actualization of potency, and potency is always directed towards a specific outcome, and that, of course, implies finality. All right. So that's the basic point. Now, the next stage that we need to do is the discussion of the two big principles, the two big metaphysical principles that form sort of two pillars of scholastic philosophy, the principle of finality and the principle of causality. And that's what we'll discuss next. So what do they say? The principle of finality says that every agent or every efficient cause acts for some end. Every agent or every efficient cause acts for some end. So basically it's just encapsulating what we've just been talking about as the second part of our discussion of the relationship between efficient and final causality, that because the potency is always directed towards some specific end, we can infer this principle, the principle of finality, that every agent or efficient cause acts for some end. The principle of causality is formulated in different ways and has different implications, but Feser insists that the fundamental formulation is one from Aquinas, which says nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. So those are the two principles. So we go to the principle of finality first. And here what we're dealing with is Aquinas' argument for the view that the reality of efficient causality entails the reality of final causality. The reality of efficient causality entails the reality of final causality. So the argument is something like this. I'll just go through the premises of it. So premise one, things that are efficient or agent causes have just the specific effects that they have rather than different ones or none at all. Things that are efficient or agent causes have just the specific effects that they have rather than different ones or none at all. So ice has the ability to cool its surroundings. Phosphor matches have the ability to create light and heat and so on. They have just the specific effects that they have rather than different ones or none at all. It's the specificity that's key here. So how do we account for this specificity of the causes for the particular effects they have? That they have only the specific effects they have and no others. Well, Aquinas says there are only two possible explanations for this, and this would be premise two. Two possible explanations for this. Either it happens just by chance, or else the causes have something in them that is directed towards or points towards just those specific effects that it is the cause of, also known as finality, right? So there are only two possible explanations for this, the fact that causes have just the specific effects that they have. Either it happens just by chance, or else the causes have something in them that's directed towards or pointed towards those specific effects that it's the cause of, the finality. Premise three, but chance is nothing other than the accidental convergence of non-accidental lines of causation. For example, bumping into an old friend or a farmer finding a treasure in a field. These happen to, or situations that happen to converge. There's one line of causation. For example, when you bump into an old friend, you happen to be going to the store. Your friend happened to be going to the store, and those two lines of causation just happen to occur. So that's what chance is, at least on Aquinas' account of chance. Chance is nothing other than the accidental convergence of non-accidental lines of causation. It's not accidental that you were going to the store because you intended to go there. It's not accidental that your friend went to the store because he intended to go there, but it's accidental that you ran into each other, right? That's the accidental convergence of the non-accidental lines. But here's the point that is premise four. These non-accidental lines of causation all involve final causality. You intended to go to the grocery store when you bumped into your friend, as did he. That is to say, you both had these goals. So chance, and this is premise five, the conclusion, chance is not really an alternative explanation to finality, since it presupposes finality. Chance is not really an alternative explanation to finality, since it presupposes finality. Premise six, therefore, finality is the only possible explanation for efficient agent causes having precisely the effects that they have. That's the conclusion. Now, also, Aquinas notes that if it just happened by chance, it wouldn't happen in the regular way that it does. You know, it's just not plausible to think that every time I put ice into my drink, it cools it off, and that just happens by chance every time. Okay? But still, that doesn't show that we need to appeal to finality. And modern philosophers, who were preceded by the Scholastic philosopher Occam, have tended to say that it's enough to appeal to efficient causality alone. William of Occam had that view, and that tends to be the mainstream modern view. The view of these sorts of philosophers is that since efficient causes necessitate their effects, you don't need to appeal to final causes in order to account for the specific effects that a cause has. But from Feser's perspective, this doesn't explain anything. What do you mean efficient causes necessitate their effects? How do you account for efficient causes necessitating their effects? What does it even mean to say this? And what it comes down to is this question. Is whatever necessitates the cause-effect connection intrinsic to the causes and effects or not? Is it intrinsic to the causes and effects or not? If not, then that means the connection is intrinsic. And that means that what necessitates the connection is something outside of the causes and effects themselves. So what could this be? Well, we can always appeal to God. But then how does God do this? Does God do this through efficient causality? If so, then you've just pushed the problem back. Or do you want to say it's in virtue of an end that God has? Think about how Aristotle talks about the first mover sort of drawing things to itself and its goodness. But then, you've reintroduced final causality back into the picture, and the whole point was to avoid it, to account for cause-effect relationships just in terms of some kind of necessary connection between causes and effects at the level of efficient causes themselves without having to appeal to final causality. And also, of course, if you bring God into the picture, that requires occasionalism, which is in its own right a kind of theologically problematic and unappealing view. Well, the other option might be that the extrinsic thing that links the causes and effects is a law of nature. A law of nature links causes and effects. People want to say that, right? But what is that exactly, this law of nature? Is it a regularity? If it's just a regularity, that doesn't explain anything. At least it doesn't explain anything without a vicious circle or a regress. Because what explains why the regularity holds? Is it another regularity at a higher level? And then you can see how that's going to lead to either a regress or circularity. Now, if we say with the scholastics that a law of nature is how things behave given their natures, a law of nature is a description of the way things tend to behave given their natures, then we've switched to the second option, intrinsic. Because now we're talking about an intrinsic feature of the thing, their intrinsic nature. But then what is this intrinsic nature? And what else could it possibly be other than a directedness towards an end within a specific efficient cause? So that's basically the line that Feser develops on behalf of Aquinas to respond to the resistance to the principle of finality among modern philosophers especially. So in sum, for Aquinas, efficient causes cannot suffice to explain cause-effect relations without final causality being involved. And the alternative here seems to be a kind of Humean skepticism about necessary connection. Without final causes, there's nothing to tie together a cause and its effect with any kind of causal necessity. Things are loose and separate, to use the famous phrase from Hume. So for Aquinas, this is the principle of finality. Now, this leads us to our second discussion question. Is Aquinas right in his view that the reality of efficient causality entails the reality of final causality? Does he give a sound argument for this view? Why or why not? If there's no link between efficient and final causality, can the necessary connection between cause and effect be preserved? So once again, second discussion question, is Aquinas right in his view that the reality of efficient causality entails the reality of final causality? Does he give a sound argument for this view? Why or why not? If there's no link between efficient and final causality, can the necessary connection between cause and effect be preserved? Okay, I'm going to conclude with just a brief word about the issue of physical intentionality. So we have this discussion of finality versus intentionality. This is a modern notion which was designed to be the mark of the mental, that is to say, or of mentality, of what distinguishes mind as opposed to matter or materiality in a modern sort of post-Cartesian sense, intentionality in this way. And this doesn't refer exactly to directedness in our normal sense of using the term intention, but it does refer to directedness in the sense of the sort of the aiming towards that conscious states are supposed to have. And once again, Feser is relating the Thomistic view, the Scholastic view, to the modern understanding of physical intentionality. Some philosophers propose, modern metaphysicians propose that there's a kind of analog to the intentionality of the mental in physical things, and that basically amounts to a sort of alternative version of the idea of there being finality in efficient or agent causes. But Feser argues that it's really, once again, it's ill-advised to swap out the scholastic language of finality for the modern language of intentional states, because there's a lot of confusion around whether this notion of intentionality actually is, sufficient or necessary for distinguishing mental states from physical states. And so to start talking about physical intentionality, once again, we're better off just sticking with the tried and true scholastic notion of finality. So once we recognize that we need to posit intrinsic teleology or finality in agent causes in order to account for the necessity with which they produce those specific effects, we come to see the value of this traditional scholastic principle of finality. So next time we'll talk about the principle of causality, the formulation of the principle, and some famous arguments against it, some famous objections that Feser addresses, and then what can be said in favor of it. And we'll try to get through the end of Chapter 2 next time.